When 9-year-old Lucy Holloway stepped into the dusty street of Mesquite Flats in 1854 and stopped a complete stranger's wagon, she carried with her the most desperate proposal a child could make. As freight hauler Samuel Morrison climbed down to face her tear-streaked determination, he had no idea that her next words would force him to choose between the life he'd planned and the family he never knew he needed. But when a desperate child looks up at you and begs you to marry her dying mother to save them both, how do you walk away? This all started when a rattlesnake coiled in the middle of the dirt road, its tail buzzing like angry bees. Samuel Morrison pulled hard on his horse's reins, sweat dripping into his eyes as the desert heat beat down on his shoulders. The snake's black eyes stared right at him, daring him to try passing by. "Easy there, Thunder," Samuel whispered to his lead horse, watching the deadly creature block their path. His wagon creaked behind him, loaded with medicine bottles that would rattle and break if Thunder spooked. The Arizona Territory in 1854 was no place for a man to lose his cargo to a scared horse. Samuel had been driving freight wagons for 15 years, but he still felt his heart pound when danger appeared. This snake looked big enough to kill a horse with one bite. The summer sun made the desert shimmer like water, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The town of Mesquite Flats lay just ahead, looking like a handful of wooden boxes scattered on the sand. Samuel could see smoke rising from chimneys and people moving between buildings. After 3 weeks on the trail, those buildings looked like paradise. But first, he had to deal with this snake. Samuel climbed down from his wagon seat, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The leather reins felt slippery in his sweaty hands. His water barrel was nearly empty, and his lips were cracked from the dry air. Every breath felt like swallowing dust. The snake's head rose higher, tongue flicking out to taste the air. Samuel had seen plenty of rattlers in his travels, but this one seemed different, bigger, meaner. Its diamond-patterned back gleamed in the sunlight like polished stone. "We don't want any trouble," Samuel said quietly, taking a small step to the right. Sometimes talking to dangerous animals helped calm them down. Sometimes it just made a man feel less alone. Thunder snorted and stamped his front hoof, making the wagon chains jingle. The other horse, Lightning, tossed his head nervously. Both animals could smell the snake's danger. Samuel reached slowly for the long stick he kept tied to his wagon side. His grandfather had taught him never to kill a snake unless he had to. "They keep the rats away from the grain," the old man used to say. But sometimes a man had to choose between his life and a snake's. The town looked so close now. Samuel could almost taste the cool water from the well and feel shade from a real roof. His stomach growled, reminding him that hardtack and dried beef were poor meals for a working man. Just as Samuel raised his stick, the snake uncoiled and slithered away into the brush. Its scales caught the light like scattered coins as it disappeared. Thunder relaxed, and Lightning stopped dancing sideways. "Well, I'll be," Samuel muttered, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. Sometimes the desert surprised you with its mercy. He climbed back onto his wagon seat and clicked his tongue. The horses started forward again, their hooves raising small clouds of dust. The wheels found their rhythm on the hard-packed earth, and the town grew larger with each passing minute. Mesquite Flats didn't look like much, maybe 30 buildings total, scattered along both sides of a main street. Most were made of adobe brick that matched the color of the desert. A few wooden structures stood out like sore thumbs, their boards already graying from the harsh sun. Samuel could see a general store, a saloon, what looked like a church at the far end of town, and several houses. Laundry hung on lines between some buildings, bright patches of color against the brown landscape. A dog trotted down the street, its tongue hanging out. The trading post sat right in the middle of town, exactly where Samuel expected to find it. That's where he would sell some of his medicine and buy supplies for the next part of his journey. California still called to him, promising cooler air and green hills. As Samuel guided his wagon down the main street, he noticed people stopping to watch him pass. A frontier town always paid attention to strangers. Some faces looked friendly, others seemed suspicious. That was normal for places where everyone knew everyone else. Children peeked out from doorways and around corners. Samuel smiled and tipped his hat to them. He remembered being curious about travelers when he was young, wondering what adventures they'd seen and where they were headed next. The horses' hooves made a steady clip-clop sound on the packed dirt. Somewhere nearby, a hammer rang against metal, probably a blacksmith working on horseshoes or wagon repairs. The smell of cooking food drifted from one of the houses, making Samuel's mouth water. But something felt wrong about this peaceful scene. Samuel couldn't put his finger on it, but his instincts were telling him to stay alert. After years on dangerous trails, a man learned to trust those feelings. Maybe it was the way some people were staring at him, or the fact that several buildings looked empty, their windows dark and their doors hanging crooked. For a town in mining country, Mesquite Flats seemed unusually quiet. Samuel slowed his horses as he approached the trading post. A wooden sign hung over the door, creaking in the hot breeze. The building looked solid enough, but something about its owner's reputation bothered Samuel. He'd heard whispers about this town in other settlements. What kind of place was Mesquite Flats, really? "You there! Stop!" The voice cracked like a whip across the afternoon air, sharp enough to make Samuel's horses prick their ears forward. He turned in his wagon seat to see a small figure darting between the shadows of a rundown cabin, moving with the desperate speed of someone chasing their last hope. A little girl burst into the sunlight, her red hair flying behind her like a copper banner. Her dress had been blue once, but now it looked more like the color of old bruises. Patches covered patches, sewn with careful stitches that spoke of loving hands and empty pockets. "Please, mister, don't leave," she called out, her bare feet slapping against the hard ground as she ran toward his wagon. Samuel pulled his horses to a stop, dust swirling around the wheels. The girl couldn't be more than 9 years old, but her green eyes held the weight of someone much older. Her chest rose and fell quickly from running, and her small hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "What's the matter, child?" Samuel asked, climbing down from his wagon seat. His voice came out gentler than usual. Something about this little girl reminded him of a wounded bird he'd once found in the desert. "I need to ask you something important," she said, looking up at him with fierce determination. "Something that might sound crazy, but I'm not crazy, I promise." Behind her, Samuel caught a glimpse of movement in the cabin's doorway. A woman stood there, thin as a willow branch, her same red hair pulled back in a bun that had seen better days. Even from this distance, he could see her hand pressed against the doorframe, as if she needed help standing up. "Lucy!" the woman called out, her voice carrying equal parts embarrassment and fear. "Come back here, this instant!" But Lucy planted her feet and ignored her mother's command. "My name's Lucy Holloway," she announced to Samuel, as if introducing herself properly would make her request seem more reasonable. "What's your name?" "Samuel Morrison," he replied, removing his hat out of politeness. The girl's courage impressed him, even though he couldn't imagine what she wanted to ask. "Mr. Morrison," Lucy said, taking a deep breath like someone about to jump off a cliff, "would you consider marrying my mama?" The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. His hat tumbled from his fingers, landing in the dust with a soft thump. Around them, the desert seemed to hold its breath, even the wind falling silent. "Lucy!" Her mother's voice cracked with horror as she hurried toward them, her movements shaky and uncertain. "I am so sorry, sir. My daughter doesn't understand." "But I do understand," Lucy interrupted, whirling around to face her mother. "Mama, you're getting sicker every day, and Miss Peterson says we have to pay him by Sunday, or we lose our home. If you had a husband, maybe he'd leave us alone." Samuel looked between the two females, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn this ordinary afternoon had taken. The woman, Lucy's mother, had reached them now, and he could see the fever flush in her cheeks and the way her hands trembled slightly. "Mrs. Holloway, I assume," Samuel said, bending to pick up his hat. "Margaret Holloway," she confirmed, her chin lifting with what remained of her pride. "And I cannot begin to apologize for my daughter's unusual approach to problem-solving." Lucy stepped closer to Samuel, her eyes never leaving his face. "I've been watching the men who come through town," she said with the serious tone of someone conducting important business. "Most of them drink too much or smell bad or kick dogs. But you stopped when I called out, and you didn't curse when you dropped your hat." Margaret's face turned red as the sun set. "Lucy, that is quite enough." "And," Lucy continued, ignoring her mother's embarrassment, "you have kind eyes. Mama always says you can tell a lot about a person by their eyes." Samuel found himself studying this unusual pair more carefully. Margaret Holloway was probably around 30, with a kind of beauty that poverty and worry couldn't completely hide. Her dress was clean but patched, her shoes worn but polished. Everything about her spoke of someone fighting to maintain dignity against impossible odds. Lucy, meanwhile, watched him with the intensity of a hawk watching a rabbit. Despite her young age, intelligence shone in her expression. This wasn't the wild idea of a silly child. It was the desperate plan of someone who'd thought through all the alternatives and found them wanting. "This Peterson fellow," Samuel said carefully. "He's the one you owe money to?" "Mr. Peterson owns most of the town," Lucy explained before her mother could speak. "He bought Papa's debt after the mine accident, and now he says Mama has to pay it all back, or—" She glanced at her mother's pale face and didn't finish the sentence. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. He'd encountered men like Peterson in other frontier towns, predators who fed on other people's misfortune. The kind of men who saw a widow and her child as opportunities rather than people deserving help. "How much money?" he asked. Margaret shook her head firmly. "I will not burden a stranger with our problems," Lucy's wild ideas aside. "Come along, daughter. Mr. Morrison has his own business to attend to." But Lucy stood her ground. $63, she announced, "plus whatever interest Mr. Peterson decides to add on. And if we can't pay by Sunday, he says we'll have to find another way to settle the debt." The threat in those words made Samuel's hands curl into fists. He'd seen enough of the frontier to understand exactly what Peterson meant by another way. The thought of this child and her sick mother facing such a choice made his stomach churn. Thunder snorted and stamped, reminding Samuel that he had his own schedule to keep. California awaited, along with the new life he'd been planning for months. Getting involved in local troubles was the last thing a smart traveler would do. But as he looked down at Lucy's hopeful face and saw the quiet desperation in Margaret's eyes, Samuel felt something shift inside his chest. Maybe some things mattered more than smart traveling. What kind of man would he be if he just drove away? A sudden crash of thunder made everyone jump, and Lucy grabbed her mother's hand tight. The storm clouds above Mesquite Flats looked angry and dark, like someone had spilled black ink across the sky. "We should get inside before this gets worse," Samuel said, looking up at the swirling clouds. He had seen storms like this before in the desert. They came fast and hit hard, turning dry creek beds into rushing rivers in minutes. Margaret hesitated at her cabin door. Her cheeks turned red with shame. "I'm sorry, but our home isn't much to look at," she said quietly. "Mama, don't say that." Lucy pulled on her mother's worn blue dress. "Our house is the cleanest one in town. You scrub everything until it shines like new pennies." Samuel smiled at the little girl's fierce pride. "I'd be honored to wait out the storm with you, if you'll have me." The first fat raindrops began hitting the dusty ground like coins dropping from the sky. Margaret opened the door wider. "Please, come in then." Inside the small cabin, Samuel stopped and stared. He had expected poverty, but what he found was something different. Every wooden surface gleamed from careful cleaning. Dried flowers hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with sweet smells. A colorful quilt covered the narrow bed, each square sewn with tiny, perfect stitches. "This is beautiful," Samuel said. And he meant it. Margaret's face softened with surprise. "Thank you. I try to make it feel like a real home, even though—" She stopped talking and looked away. "Even though what, Mama?" Lucy asked, climbing onto one of the wooden chairs. "Even though we might have to leave soon," Margaret finished quietly. Samuel removed his dusty hat and set it on the small table. Outside, the rain began drumming harder against the roof. "Tell me about this debt," he said gently. Margaret's hands shook as she poured water from a clay pitcher into 3 tin cups. "I shouldn't burden a stranger with our troubles." "But you're not a stranger," Lucy announced. "You're the nicest man who's come through town in months. Most of them smell bad and yell at their horses. You talk to yours like they're friends." Samuel chuckled. "Horses are good listeners. They don't judge you for your mistakes." "See?" Lucy turned to her mother triumphantly. "He's different." Margaret sat down across from Samuel, her green eyes filled with worry. "Mr. Peterson owns most of the buildings in Mesquite Flats. When my husband got sick last winter, we needed money for medicine. Henry was coughing up blood and could barely stand. Papa worked in the silver mine," Lucy added, her voice getting small. "He said the dust was making everyone sick, but they needed the work." Samuel nodded. He had seen mining towns before. The promise of silver or gold drew men like moths to a flame, even when the flame burned them. "Peterson loaned us $63, Margaret continued. "It seemed like a blessing at the time. Henry needed that medicine, and Peterson said we could pay it back slowly. But then the mine roof fell down," Lucy whispered. "Papa got trapped underneath all those rocks." The cabin fell silent, except for the rain pounding on the roof. Samuel could see the pain in both their faces, fresh as if it had happened yesterday, instead of months ago. "I'm sorry for your loss," Samuel said. "Your husband sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I ever knew," Margaret replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He would sing Lucy to sleep every night, even when he was too tired to stand up straight." Lucy smiled through her tears. "Papa had the prettiest voice. He said music made everything better, even the hard days." Samuel looked around the cabin again, noticing things he had missed before. A man's heavy coat hung on a wooden peg by the door. Work boots sat neatly in the corner, too big for either woman but kept clean and ready. This family still lived with the ghost of someone they loved. "So now Peterson wants all the money at once?" Samuel asked. Margaret nodded miserably. "He says, I've had enough time to pay, but washing clothes and mending shirts only brings in a few cents each week. I've tried everything I can think of." "That's why I asked you to marry Mama," Lucy said, looking directly at Samuel. "I've been watching all the men who come through town. Some are mean. Some drink too much whiskey. Some look at Mama in ways that make her uncomfortable." Samuel raised his eyebrows. This little girl was far more observant than most adults he knew. "But you're different," Lucy continued. "When your horse stumbled earlier, you patted his neck and spoke kindly to him. Mean men are mean to animals, too." Margaret's face turned red again. "Lucy, you can't just ask strangers to marry your mother. It's not proper." "Why not?" Lucy asked. "Papa always said when you need help, you should ask for it directly. Being shy doesn't fix problems." Thunder crashed overhead so loudly that the cabin walls seemed to shake. Samuel stood up and walked to the small window, watching lightning fork across the dark sky. The storm was getting worse, which meant he would be staying the night whether he wanted to or not. But the strange thing was, he did want to stay. He turned back to face the two women. Margaret sat straight in her chair, trying to maintain her dignity even while her world fell apart around her. Lucy watched him with hopeful eyes, believing that somehow this stranger might be the answer to their prayers. "What happens if you can't pay Peterson by Sunday?" Samuel asked. Margaret's voice came out as barely a whisper. "He says we'll have to leave town, but we have nowhere else to go." Samuel felt something twist in his chest. He had spent 15 years traveling from town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to get attached. He had convinced himself that being alone was easier, safer. No one could disappoint you if you didn't let them get close. But looking at this small family fighting so hard to stay together, he wondered if maybe he had been wrong about a lot of things. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret said suddenly, "you should know that even if you wanted to help us, Peterson isn't the kind of man who gives up easily. He has friends in this town. Important friends." Samuel nodded slowly. He had met men like Peterson before, bullies who used money and fear to control others, the kind of men who only respected strength. "What kind of friends?" he asked. Lucy looked scared for the first time since he had met her. "Bad ones," she whispered. Lightning flashed outside the window, turning everything white for a split second before plunging the cabin back into shadows. In that brief moment of harsh light, Samuel saw something that made his blood run cold. Margaret's left arm, usually hidden beneath her long sleeves, bore the purple-yellow marks of old bruises. "Mrs. Holloway," Samuel said carefully, "has Peterson ever hurt you?" Margaret's hand flew to her arm, pulling the fabric tighter around her wrist. "I don't know what you mean." But Lucy's small voice cut through her mother's denial, like a knife through butter. "He grabbed Mama's arm real hard last week when she said she needed more time to pay. I saw the marks." "Lucy!" Margaret's voice carried warning, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes now. "I was hiding behind the flour barrel at the store," Lucy continued, her words tumbling out fast. "Mr. Peterson said mean things to Mama. He said if she couldn't pay with money, maybe she could pay another way. It made Mama cry." Samuel felt anger building in his chest like steam in a kettle. He had dealt with plenty of rough men in his travels, but men who threatened women and children were the worst kind of cowards. "How often does Peterson come around?" Samuel asked, working hard to keep his voice calm. Margaret stood up and walked to the stove, keeping her back to him. "Every few days. He says he's just checking on his investment." "But he always comes when I'm supposed to be at the schoolhouse," Lucy added. "Mama thinks I don't know, but I've been skipping lessons to watch the cabin, just in case." Samuel's heart ached for this little girl who was trying to protect her mother. No child should have to carry such heavy worries. Thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The storm was settling in for a long stay. "Lucy," Samuel said gently, "come here for a minute." The little girl walked over to him, her green eyes curious. Samuel knelt down so they were at the same height. "You're very brave," he told her, "but you're also very young. Adults should protect children, not the other way around." Lucy's chin lifted stubbornly. "But who's going to protect Mama if I don't? Papa's gone, and we don't have any other family." "What about your grandparents?" Samuel asked. Margaret turned around from the stove, her face sad. "My parents died of cholera when Lucy was little. Henry's family lives back east, but they never approved of him marrying a poor girl like me. They probably don't even know he's dead." Samuel was beginning to understand just how alone these two really were. In a place like Mesquite Flats, being alone and female was dangerous. Peterson knew it, and he was using their isolation against them. "Tell me more about this town," Samuel said. "Who else has power here besides Peterson?" Lucy perked up. "Well, there's Sheriff Williams, but he's scared of Mr. Peterson too, and Reverend Hayes tries to help people, but he doesn't have any money. Oh, and there's Mrs. Chen who runs the laundry, but she's Chinese, so people don't listen to her much." Samuel frowned. A sheriff who was afraid of a businessman was no sheriff at all. "What about the other miners? The other families?" "Most of them owe Peterson money too," Margaret said quietly. "That's how he keeps control. He loans money when people are desperate, then uses the debt to make them do what he wants." "It's like he owns the whole town," Lucy said. "Papa used to say Peterson was like a spider sitting in the middle of a web, catching anyone who tried to fly free." Samuel stood up and walked back to the window. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the dusty street into a muddy river. He could see lights in the windows of other cabins, families huddled together against the storm. How many of them were afraid? How many owed Peterson money they couldn't pay? Mr. Morrison, Margaret said softly, I need you to understand something. Even if you wanted to help us, it wouldn't be safe for you. Peterson has ways of making life difficult for people who cross him. Samuel turned to face her. What kind of ways? Lucy answered before her mother could stop her. He burned down Mr. Fletcher's barn after Mr. Fletcher said bad things about him, and he got Mrs. Rodriguez's son thrown in jail on made-up charges. Margaret closed her eyes, as if the words caused her physical pain. Lucy, you shouldn't repeat gossip. It's not gossip if it's true, Lucy protested. Everyone knows what Peterson does. They're just too scared to say it out loud. Samuel felt pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind. Peterson didn't just control this town through money. He controlled it through fear. And fear, Samuel knew, was often more powerful than guns or laws. But fear worked both ways. How long have you lived here? Samuel asked Margaret. 3 years. We came here when Lucy was 6. Henry heard there was good work in the mines, and we thought, she shrugged helplessly, we thought we could build a better life. And you have, Samuel said firmly. Look at this place. Look at your daughter. You've built something beautiful here, even in hard circumstances. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. But what good is it if we lose everything anyway? Samuel walked over to where Lucy stood beside her mother. The little girl reached up and took his hand, her small fingers surprisingly strong. Mr. Morrison, Lucy said seriously, if you married Mama, would you stay here in Mesquite Flats? Or would you take us away? It was a fair question, and Samuel found himself thinking carefully about the answer. He had always been a man who moved on when things got complicated. But something about this place, these people, made him want to stay and fight. I don't know, he said honestly, but I think sometimes the best thing to do is stand your ground. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment of brightness, Samuel saw something else. Through the rain-streaked window, he caught a glimpse of a figure standing across the street, watching their cabin. Someone was out there in the storm, keeping an eye on them. And Samuel had a pretty good idea who it might be. A sound like a mountain falling apart crashed through the desert air. Samuel's head snapped up as the first raindrops hit his weathered hands like cold bullets. In the distance, black clouds rolled toward Mesquite Flats like an angry army, and he knew this storm meant business. We need to get inside right now, Samuel said, grabbing his saddlebags from the wagon. Lightning split the sky in half, turning everything white for one scary second. Lucy squeaked and grabbed her mother's dress. Margaret looked at the approaching storm, then at Samuel, then back at the storm. Her face showed she was thinking hard about something important. Mr. Morrison, we can't ask you to stay. It wouldn't be proper. But Lucy stomped her small foot in the dust. Mama, proper won't keep him from getting struck by lightning. Another thunder crash made them all jump. Besides, he might say yes to marrying you if he stays for supper. Samuel almost smiled at the girl's simple logic. The wind picked up, blowing dust devils across the street and making the wooden signs creak like old bones. His horses pawed the ground nervously, sensing the storm's power. Your daughter makes a good point about the lightning, Samuel said, tying his horses to the post near Margaret's cabin. And I've got medicine in my wagon that shouldn't get soaked. If you'll have me, I'd be grateful for shelter. Margaret's cheeks turned pink, but she nodded. Of course. Come inside, quickly. The moment they stepped through the door, the sky opened up like someone had torn a huge hole in it. Rain pounded the roof so hard they had to raise their voices to talk. Samuel looked around the small cabin with new eyes, noticing things he'd missed before. Every inch of the place was clean as a church on Sunday. The wooden floor had been scrubbed until it almost glowed. Dried wildflowers sat in a jar on the table, bringing color to the simple room. A woman's touch showed everywhere, in the neat way the dishes were arranged, in the pretty quilt folded on the single bed, in the way even the poorest furniture had been arranged to feel welcoming. But Samuel also noticed what wasn't there. No extra clothes hanging on the pegs, no abundance of food in the cupboard. No man's boots by the door, though he could see the lighter spots on the wood where Boots had once sat every day. "Lucy, help me get some wood for the fire," Margaret said. But Lucy was already staring out the window at the storm with wide eyes. "Look how the lightning makes everything look like daytime." Lucy pressed her nose against the glass. "Do you think it's dangerous, Mr. Morrison?" Samuel joined her at the window, watching the electrical show outside. "Storms can be dangerous, that's true, but they also bring good things. Rain for the crops. Cool air when it's been too hot, sometimes." He glanced at Margaret, who was trying to build up the fire with shaking hands. "Sometimes storms bring exactly what people need, even if they don't know it yet." The fire caught, sending warm light dancing across the cabin walls. Margaret sat back on her heels, looking tired but satisfied. "There, that should keep us warm and dry." Samuel noticed her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "Mrs. Holloway, are you feeling all right?" Lucy answered before her mother could. "Mama gets shaky when she's scared." "She's been scared a lot since Papa died." The little girl said it matter-of-factly, the way children do when they've learned to live with hard truths. Margaret's face went red. "Lucy, Mr. Morrison doesn't need to hear about our troubles." But Samuel knelt down so he could look Lucy in the eye. "Actually, I think I do need to hear about them. Because your mama and I are talking about something very important, and I need to understand what I'd be getting into." Lucy brightened immediately. "You mean you're really thinking about marrying her?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Samuel looked at Margaret, seeing the hope and fear fighting in her green eyes. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, time seemed to slow down. "I'm thinking about a lot of things," Samuel said carefully. "But first, I need to know more about this debt you mentioned, and about Mr. Peterson." Margaret's shoulders sagged like she was carrying a heavy load. "Harold Peterson owns most of this town. The general store, the saloon, half the houses. When my husband got sick," she stopped, pressing her lips together. "Papa couldn't work in the mine anymore because he was coughing up blood." Lucy continued when her mother couldn't. "So Mr. Peterson said he'd lend us money for medicine. But then Papa died anyway, and now Mr. Peterson wants all the money back at once." Samuel felt anger growing in his chest like a hot coal. "How much money are we talking about?" $63, Margaret whispered. "It might as well be 1,000. The number hit Samuel like a punch to the stomach. $63 was more than most frontier families saw in half a year. But it was also exactly the amount he had saved up in his saddlebags, money he'd planned to use to start his own freight business in California. Thunder crashed again, closer this time. The cabin's windows rattled in their frames. "And if you can't pay?" Samuel asked, though he had a feeling he already knew the answer. Margaret's voice got very quiet. "Then we lose the cabin. And Peterson has made it clear that he'd be willing to forgive the debt in exchange for other considerations." Lucy looked confused, but Samuel understood perfectly. His hands clenched into fists without him meaning to. "What kind of other considerations?" Margaret couldn't meet his eyes. The kind a decent woman doesn't discuss with strangers. But Samuel wasn't feeling like a stranger anymore. Somehow, in the space of a few hours, these two females had become important to him. The storm outside seemed to be washing away his old life, his old plans, his old ideas about what mattered. The storm passed sometime after midnight, leaving the desert air cool and clean for the first time in weeks. Samuel woke before dawn, listening to the peaceful sounds of a household beginning to stir. Margaret moved quietly around the small kitchen area, trying not to wake her guests. But Samuel had always been a light sleeper. "Good morning," he said softly, sitting up on his bedroll. Margaret jumped slightly, then smiled. "I'm sorry. I was trying to be quiet." "Don't apologize. I've been awake for a while, just thinking." Samuel stood and folded his blanket neatly. "Smells like coffee." "Such as it is," Margaret said with a slight smile. We've been making it weak to make it last longer. Samuel reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a small cloth pouch. Real coffee beans from Santa Fe. Consider it payment for the shelter. Margaret's eyes went wide. Oh, I couldn't. Coffee is too expensive to... Ma'am, I've drunk weak coffee and strong coffee, and I can tell you that sharing strong coffee with good company beats drinking weak coffee alone every single time. Lucy stirred in her corner, then sat up with her hair sticking out in all directions. Is that real coffee I smell? It is indeed, Samuel said. Your mother was just about to make us all a proper breakfast. The morning routine felt surprisingly natural. Margaret cooked eggs and cornbread on her small stove, while Samuel helped Lucy wash her face and hands in the basin. It struck him how easily they all fit together, like puzzle pieces that had been looking for each other without knowing it. As they sat around the small table sharing the best coffee any of them had tasted in months, Samuel found himself studying this little family with new eyes. Margaret moved with quiet grace, making sure Lucy and Samuel had enough before serving herself. Lucy chattered about everything and nothing, the way children do when they feel safe and happy. Mr. Morrison, Lucy said between bites of cornbread, have you ever had a family before? The question was innocent, but it hit Samuel right in the heart. I was married once, for a short time. My wife's name was Catherine. What happened to her? Lucy asked, with the direct curiosity of childhood. Lucy, Margaret warned gently, but Samuel held up a hand. It's all right. She died during our first winter together. We lived in a cabin not much bigger than this one, up in the mountains. The fever took her before the snow melted. Margaret's hand moved instinctively toward his across the table, then stopped halfway. I'm so sorry. It was a long time ago, Samuel said, but his voice carried old pain. We had plans, Catherine and I. We were going to have children, build a farm, grow old together watching our grandchildren play in the yard. Lucy leaned forward, her green eyes serious. Do you still miss her? Samuel considered the question carefully. I'll always miss her, but missing someone and being ready to love someone else are two different things. The words surprised him as he said them. He hadn't planned to get so personal, but something about this cabin, these people, made honesty feel safe. Margaret looked down at her coffee cup. After my husband died, I thought I'd never want another man in my life. The pain of losing someone you love is... She shook her head, unable to finish. Like having a piece of your heart cut out, Samuel finished quietly. Yes, exactly like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, understanding passing between them without words. Lucy looked back and forth between the adults, sensing something important happening but not quite understanding what. But, Margaret continued, Lucy needs a father. And I need. She paused, searching for the right words. I need help. I've been trying to do everything myself, but it's too much. Samuel nodded. And I need to stop running from place to place like I'm being chased by something. Maybe it's time I planted some roots. Lucy's face lit up like the sun coming out from behind clouds. So you really will marry Mama? Samuel looked at Margaret, seeing hope and fear warring in her expression. That depends on what your mother wants. Margaret met his gaze steadily. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Morrison. If we did this thing, it wouldn't be a love match. At least not at first. It would be practical. Sensible. Sometimes the best marriages start with practical and sensible, Samuel replied. Love can grow between people who respect each other and work toward the same goals. And what would your goals be? Margaret asked. Samuel thought about it. To build something good, to take care of the people who matter to me, to stop Peterson from hurting you and Lucy. His voice hardened on the last point. Lucy clapped her hands together. This is the best day ever. But Margaret still looked worried. There's something else you should know. About Peterson. He's not just greedy, he's dangerous. Last year, a man named Williams tried to start a competing general store. His shop burned down mysteriously, and Williams left town the next day. Samuel's jaw tightened. Are you saying Peterson would hurt us if we got married? I'm saying he doesn't like losing, and he considers me an asset he plans to collect. The ugly truth hung in the air between them. Samuel felt his anger toward Peterson growing stronger, but he also felt something else, a fierce protectiveness toward this woman and child who had somehow become important to him overnight. Let me ask you something, Samuel said. If money wasn't a problem, if the debt was paid and Peterson was out of the picture, would you still want to marry me? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. You're a good man, Samuel Morrison. You're kind to my daughter. You didn't take advantage when you could have, and you've treated me with respect when you had every reason to think poorly of us. That's not really an answer. Margaret smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. Yes, even if money wasn't a problem, I think I would still want to marry you. Lucy whooped with joy, but Samuel held up a hand. Then we have a problem to solve, he said, because I'm not going to let Harold Peterson keep terrorizing you, whether we get married or not. Lightning split the sky like a giant's axe, and Lucy jumped so hard she nearly fell off her wooden stool. The storm had turned their small cabin into an island floating in a sea of rain and wind. Samuel watched water drip steadily from a loose board in the ceiling, forming a growing puddle near the door. Margaret moved quickly to place a tin pot underneath, the metallic pings creating an odd rhythm with the thunder outside. Storms like this can last for days, Margaret said, wringing out a wet cloth she'd used to wipe the windowsill. The roof holds, mostly, but we might be stuck together longer than you planned. Samuel shifted on his makeshift bed in the corner, his back aching from the hard floor. He'd slept in worse places, under wagon wheels during hailstorms, in caves with rattlesnakes for company, but something about this cabin made him restless. Maybe it was the way Lucy kept stealing glances at him, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Maybe it was how Margaret moved around the small space with such care, treating their few belongings like treasures. I don't mind storms, Lucy announced, settling cross-legged on her narrow bed. Papa used to say thunder was just God moving furniture around up there. Margaret's smile flickered like candlelight. Your father had interesting ideas about many things. Samuel found himself curious about the man who had lived in this place before him. The ghost of James Holloway seemed to fill every corner. His pipe still sat on the mantel, his work shirt hung on a wooden peg. His presence felt as real as the rain drumming overhead. What kind of work did your husband do? Samuel asked, immediately regretting the question when he saw Margaret's face tighten. He was a miner, she said simply. Thought he could strike silver and make us rich. Instead, he struck his grave. Lucy's eyes grew wide. Mama, you never talk about Papa that way. Your Papa was a dreamer, sweetheart. Dreams can be dangerous things. The words hit Samuel like cold water. He'd been a dreamer once too, planning a life with his young wife, imagining the children they'd raise, the farm they'd build. Those dreams had died with her, buried under 6 feet of frozen ground during that terrible winter. But looking at Lucy now, watching her small hands fold her few clothes with the same careful attention her mother gave everything, Samuel felt something stir in his chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Maybe dreams aren't dangerous, he said quietly. Maybe giving up on them is what's really dangerous. Margaret stopped moving. She stood perfectly still, holding a mended sock in her hands, staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. Outside, the wind howled like a wild animal, shaking the cabin walls and rattling the single window. But inside, the silence stretched between them like a rope bridge, fragile, but offering the possibility of crossing to somewhere new. Mr. Morrison, Margaret said finally, her voice barely louder than the rain. What kind of dreams do you have? Samuel looked around the small cabin, taking in the carefully patched quilt, the swept floor, the way Lucy had arranged her few treasures on a wooden crate beside her bed. He thought about his wagon outside, loaded with medical supplies destined for strangers in distant camps. He thought about the California plans he'd been carrying for 3 years, always just out of reach. "I used to dream about settling down," he admitted, "building something permanent instead of just moving from place to place. But after my wife died, it seemed easier to keep traveling. Safer, somehow." Lucy leaned forward on her bed, her green eyes bright with interest. "But what if you didn't have to choose? What if you could travel and have a family too?" The idea hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. Margaret set down the sock and moved to check on their meager supper beans and bacon heating over the small fire. Samuel watched her hands, noting how they never quite stopped moving, always finding something to tend or fix or clean. "Your daughter has an interesting way of looking at problems," he told Margaret. "She gets that from her father." Margaret replied, but this time her voice held warmth instead of bitterness. "James always believed there was a solution to everything if you just looked at it from the right angle." Thunder crashed overhead again, so loud it seemed to shake the very bones of the earth. Lucy squealed and dove under her quilt, but Samuel noticed she was giggling rather than scared. "Are you afraid of storms, Mr. Morrison?" she asked from beneath the blanket. "No," Samuel said, "but I'm afraid of other things." Margaret turned from the fire, her eyebrows raised in question. Samuel found himself speaking words he'd never said aloud before. "I'm afraid of caring about people again. I'm afraid of building something just to watch it get torn down. I'm afraid of—" He paused, looking directly at Margaret. "I'm afraid of being the kind of man who walks away when someone needs help." The confession seemed to surprise all three of them. Margaret's face softened, and Lucy poked her head out from under the quilt with newfound respect in her eyes. "Papa used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid," Lucy said seriously. "It's about doing the right thing even when you are afraid." Samuel felt something crack open inside his chest, like ice breaking up in spring. Here was this small girl who had lost her father and faced losing her mother and home, giving him lessons about courage. "Your papa was a wise man," Samuel said. "He was," Margaret agreed, settling into the chair across from Samuel. "But wisdom and survival aren't always the same thing. James was wise enough to see what was right, but not practical enough to make it work." Samuel studied her face in the firelight, seeing the strength that had kept their small family afloat despite everything. "Maybe that's where someone like me could be useful. I'm not particularly wise, but I know how to make things work." Margaret's breath caught slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Morrison?" Before Samuel could answer, a new sound cut through the storm hoofbeats, splashing through puddles, coming closer to the cabin. Margaret's face went pale, and Lucy sat up straight in her bed. "Who would be out in this weather?" Margaret whispered. Samuel was already on his feet, moving toward the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could see a dark figure on horseback, hunched against the storm, but definitely heading their way. "Expecting anyone?" he asked quietly. Margaret shook her head, fear creeping into her voice. "Nobody good comes calling in weather like this." The hoofbeats stopped outside their door. Act 8. A heavy fist pounded on the cabin door like thunder that wouldn't quit. Samuel grabbed his gun belt from where it hung on a wooden peg, buckling it around his waist with practiced speed. Margaret pulled Lucy close, both of them staring at the door as if it might burst into flames. "Mrs. Holloway!" a voice boomed from outside. "Open up! I know you're in there." Margaret's face went white as fresh snow. "It's Peterson," she whispered. "But why would he come out in this storm?" Samuel moved quietly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The rain made it hard to see clearly, but Peterson sat on his horse like a mountain, water streaming off his hat and coat. Behind him, barely visible through the downpour, Samuel could make out at least 2 other riders. "He brought friends," Samuel muttered. Another series of pounding shook the door. "I know that stranger's wagon is out there, Holloway. We need to have ourselves a conversation." Lucy buried her face against her mother's shoulder, her small body trembling. Margaret's arms tightened protectively around her daughter, but Samuel could see the fear in her eyes, the look of someone who had been pushed too far for too long. "What do we do?" Margaret whispered. Samuel studied the cabin quickly, noting the back window that opened onto the small yard behind the house. The door was solid oak, but the hinges looked old. If Peterson really wanted to get in, he probably could. "We answer," Samuel said firmly, "but on our terms." He moved to the door, but didn't open it. "What do you want, Peterson? It's a little late for social calls." Peterson's laugh cut through the rain like a rusty blade. "Funny you should mention social calls, Morrison. See, I've been doing some thinking about you and the widow here. Started wondering what kind of man shows up out of nowhere and gets so friendly so fast." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. "Say what you came to say." "I sent a telegram to Tucson this afternoon before the storm hit. Asked around about freight haulers named Morrison. Interesting thing seems, there is a Samuel Morrison who's wanted for questioning about some missing cargo, valuable medical supplies that never made it to their destination." Margaret gasped softly behind him. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "You're fishing, Peterson." "Am I? Tell me, Morrison, where exactly were you planning to deliver that wagon full of supplies? And why are you so eager to help a woman you just met?" The accusation hit Samuel like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because of how it would sound to Margaret and Lucy. He turned slightly, seeing doubt creep into Margaret's green eyes for the first time since they'd met. "That's not," Samuel started, but Peterson's voice cut him off. "Course, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you're exactly what you appear to be, Good Samaritan with a heart of gold. But the territorial marshal might be real interested in having a conversation with you either way." Samuel's mind raced. The medical supplies in his wagon were legitimate, purchased with his own money, and destined for the mining camps west of Phoenix. But Peterson didn't need the truth, he just needed doubt. "What do you want?" Samuel called out. "Simple trade. You leave town tonight, storm or no storm, and I forget about sending that telegram to the marshal. You stay, and I might remember some additional details about suspicious cargo movements." Margaret stepped closer to Samuel, her voice barely a whisper. "Is he telling the truth? About the cargo?" Samuel looked down at her, seeing the war between trust and fear playing out across her face. Lucy peeked around her mother's arm, her young eyes wide with confusion and worry. "No," Samuel said simply, "but that doesn't matter if people believe him." Peterson's voice boomed again. "Time's running out, Morrison. What's it going to be?" Samuel felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, but inside the cabin, everything had changed. The easy companionship of the evening had shattered like glass, replaced by suspicion and fear. But as Samuel looked at Lucy, really looked at Hare, he saw something that stopped him cold. The little girl wasn't looking at him with doubt or fear. She was looking at him with fierce determination, the same expression she'd worn when she'd stepped into the street and asked him to marry her mother. "Mr. Morrison," Lucy said quietly, "my papa always said you can tell what kind of man someone is by watching how they treat animals and strangers. You were gentle with your horses, and you stopped for me when you didn't have to." Her simple faith hit Samuel harder than Peterson's threats ever could. Margaret's hand touched his arm, light as a butterfly landing. "Samuel," she said, using his first name for the first time, "whatever you've done or haven't done, whatever Peterson thinks he knows it, doesn't change what you've already shown us." Samuel felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot finally coming untied. Here were two Papala desperate women and a determined child choosing to trust him despite everything. Despite Peterson's accusations, despite the storm, despite every reason they had to doubt. "I'm not leaving," Samuel called out to Peterson. "And if you want to send telegrams, go ahead. But you'll do it from town, not from my doorstep." Peterson's curses were lost in a crash of thunder. But Samuel could hear the horses moving, circling the cabin like wolves around a campfire. "This isn't over, Morrison," Peterson shouted. "Come morning, we'll see how brave you feel." The hoofbeats faded gradually, swallowed by the storm. Samuel waited several minutes before moving away from the window, making sure Peterson and his men were really gone. When he turned back to Margaret and Lucy, he found them watching him with expressions he couldn't quite read. The cabin felt different, now smaller somehow, but also safer, as if they had crossed some invisible line together. "So," Margaret said, smoothing Lucy's hair with gentle fingers, "what happens tomorrow?" Samuel looked around the small cabin one more time, taking in the careful cleanliness, the patched furniture, the way these two women had made a home out of almost nothing. He thought about his wagon waiting outside, about the plans he'd carried for 3 years, about the life he'd been living alone on the road. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we find out what kind of family we're going to be." Lucy's face broke into a grin that could have lit up the whole desert. Margaret's smile was smaller, more cautious, but real. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, 3 people sat by the fire and began planning a future none of them had imagined just days before. The little girl's desperate plea was becoming something none of them had expected, not just a marriage of convenience, but the foundation of something stronger than storms, deeper than doubt, and more lasting than the fears that had brought them together. The heavy boots on the wooden porch sounded like thunder rolling across the mountains. Margaret's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, crashing to the floor in a shower of brown liquid and white pieces. Lucy grabbed her mother's skirt and pressed her face against the faded fabric. Samuel had heard those same boots before yesterday at the general store, where other customers had suddenly found reasons to leave when their owner walked in. Today, those boots belonged to a man who filled the entire doorway like a storm cloud blocking out the sun. "Mrs. Holloway." Peterson's voice was smooth as honey poured over broken glass. His eyes swept across the small cabin, taking in every detail like a hawk studying mice. "I see you have company." The man stood at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that stretched his black coat tight across his back. His beard was perfectly trimmed, and his boots shined despite the dusty streets outside. Everything about him screamed money and power, the kind that came from taking what others needed to survive. "I'm sorry to interrupt you right here, but if you're enjoying this story thus far, please consider to subscribe to our channel so that you can enjoy so many more in the future. And by the way, don't hesitate to like the video as well, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now enjoy the rest of the story." Margaret stood slowly, her hands shaking as she smoothed down her dress. "Mr. Peterson, we weren't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't." Peterson stepped inside without being invited, his presence making the cabin feel half its size. Behind him, Samuel could see 2 other men waiting on the porch, hired guns with cold eyes and quick hands. And who might this be? Samuel rose from his chair, moving carefully. He had faced down angry bears and desperate outlaws, but something about Peterson made his skin crawl. This wasn't just a bully, this was a predator who enjoyed the hunt. "Samuel Morrison," he said, keeping his voice level. "Just passing through." "How convenient." Peterson smiled, showing teeth white as bleached bones. "I came to discuss Mrs. Holloway's living arrangements. Perhaps you'd prefer to step outside while we handle our business?" The threat hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire. Samuel could see Lucy trembling against her mother's side, could hear Margaret's quick, shallow breathing. Outside, storm clouds were gathering again, promising another night of rain and wind. "Actually," Samuel said, surprising himself with how calm his voice sounded, "I think Mrs. Holloway's living arrangements are about to change." Peterson's eyebrows rose like dark wings. "Is that so? And what makes you think that?" Samuel felt the moment stretch like a rope about to snap. Everything depended on what he said next. Behind Peterson, he could see the town through the open door, other folks pretending not to watch while they swept their porches or fed their chickens. Everyone knew what was happening, but nobody dared interfere. "Because Mrs. Holloway has agreed to become my wife." The words came out stronger than Samuel felt inside. Margaret's gasp was soft as a whisper, but Peterson heard it. The big man's smile grew wider, like a cat that had cornered a mouse. Marriage? Peterson laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a cliff. To a man she met yesterday? How romantic. Love works in mysterious ways, Samuel replied, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Peterson took another step into the cabin. Now Samuel could smell high-expensive soap mixed with whiskey and something else. Something dangerous. Well, congratulations are certainly in order, but this doesn't solve our little problem, does it? What problem is that? Samuel asked, though he already knew. The $63 Mrs. Holloway owes me, plus interest, of course, and late fees. Peterson pulled a piece of paper from his coat pocket, unfolding it with the care of a man handling a weapon. According to territorial law, when a woman marries, her husband takes on all her debts. Are you prepared for that responsibility, Mr. Morrison? Samuel looked at the paper covered with numbers and legal words that made his head spin. $63 might as well have been $600. It represented more money than most families in Mesquite Flats saw in a year. But as he watched Lucy peek out from behind her mother's skirt, as he saw the fear in Margaret's green eyes, Samuel realized something important. Some things were worth more than money. Some fights were worth having, even when you couldn't win. I am, he said simply. Peterson folded the paper back up, tucking it away like a snake returning to its hole. Excellent. Then you have until Sunday to pay. That's, he paused, pretending to count on his fingers. 3 days. I do hope you have that kind of money just lying around. The big man turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, and Mr. Morrison? This is a dangerous territory. Accidents happen to people who don't understand how things work around here. I'd hate for your new family to suffer because of your generosity. With that, Peterson stepped back onto the porch. His boots echoed across the wooden boards as he walked away, followed by his two shadows. But Samuel could feel those cold eyes watching from across the street, could sense the threat hanging over them, like storm clouds ready to burst. Inside the cabin, the silence stretched like a held breath. Margaret sank into her chair as if her legs could no longer hold her up. Lucy crept closer to Samuel, her small hand finding his rough fingers. Did you mean it? She whispered. About marrying Mama? Samuel looked down at the little girl, at her hopeful eyes, and brave Chinthan at her mother. Margaret was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that might have been the beginning of trust. I meant it, he said, and realized it was true. The cabin felt different after Peterson left, smaller somehow, as if his presence had sucked all the air out of the room. Margaret sat perfectly still in her wooden chair, staring at her hands folded in her lap. Lucy had found her rag doll and was hugging it tight, though her eyes never left Samuel's face. Outside, the storm clouds were getting darker. Samuel could hear the wind picking up, rattling the shutters and sending dust devils dancing down the street. In a few hours, the rain would start again, turning the roads into rivers of mud. Mrs. Holloway, Samuel began, then stopped. The name felt too formal now, after what had just happened. Margaret, we need to talk. She looked up at him then, and Samuel saw something that made his chest tight. This wasn't just fear, it was the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had been fighting too long with too little. You don't understand what you've done, she said quietly. Peterson doesn't make idle threats. He controls this whole town. The sheriff, the judge, even the preacher, they all owe him money or favors. If he decides he doesn't like our arrangement, then we'll figure something out. Samuel pulled his chair closer, sitting down so he was at her eye level. But first, tell me everything. How did this debt happen? What exactly does Peterson want? Margaret's hands twisted in her skirt, the same nervous gesture he'd seen in Lucy. My husband, Robert, worked in the silver mine up on Eagle Ridge. Good work, steady pay. But last winter, he started coughing. At first, we thought it was just dust from the mine, but it got worse. Much worse. Lucy set down her doll and climbed onto her mother's lap, fitting against Margaret's side like she belonged there. Papa couldn't stop coughing, she added. Sometimes there was blood. The doctor said Robert needed medicine, expensive medicine from back east. Peterson offered to loan us the money. Margaret's voice got quieter. $63 for 2 bottles of patent medicine that promised to cure lung disease. Samuel felt his jaw clench. Patent medicines were mostly alcohol and sugar water, sold to desperate people by men who didn't care about anything but profit. Did it help? For a while, we thought so. Robert seemed stronger, able to work again. But then, Margaret's voice broke. The mine collapsed during a spring storm. Robert and 6 other men were trapped inside. The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Samuel could picture it all too clearly, the frantic digging, the desperate hope, the terrible moment when hope turned to grief. They found the bodies 3 days later. Margaret continued. Peterson came to the funeral. He was very kind, very understanding. Said there was no rush to pay back the money, that he knew I was grieving. But that changed, Samuel guessed. After a month, he started coming by. At first, it was just to check on us, to see if we needed anything. But then, his visits got more personal. Margaret shuddered. He said he had a solution to our money problem, that a woman in my situation needed a man's protection. Samuel understood immediately. Peterson wasn't just a loan shark. He was a predator who used debt to trap vulnerable women. The realization made his hands curl into fists. Have you been paying him anything? Whatever I can. Margaret gestured around the spotless cabin. I take in washing, do mending, sell vegetables from the garden. But it's never enough. He adds interest every month, late fees when I can't pay the full amount. The debt keeps growing no matter what I do. Lucy spoke up, her voice small but fierce. That's why I asked you to marry Mama. I've been watching the men who come through town, trying to find one who wasn't mean or drunk or scary. The simple honesty of it hit Samuel like a physical blow. A 9-year-old girl had taken on the responsibility of finding her mother a husband because she understood, in the way children sometimes do, that the adult world had failed them. And you picked me, Samuel said gently. Why? Lucy considered this seriously. You stopped when I called out. Most folks just keep riding. And when your horses shied at that rattlesnake yesterday, you didn't beat them or yell. You just waited until they calmed down. Samuel remembered the momentous small brown snake sunning itself in the road, his horses dancing nervously around it. He had simply sat quietly until they settled, then guided them carefully around the creature. To him, it had been nothing. To Lucy, it had been a test of character. There's something else, Margaret said suddenly. Something you need to know before you make any promises you might regret. Samuel waited, though something in her tone made him nervous. Peterson filed a claim with the territorial court yesterday. He says that under frontier law, when someone can't pay their debts, they can be bound to service until the debt is satisfied. He's trying to make me his property. The word hung between them like a curse. Samuel felt something cold and dangerous uncurl in his chest. He had seen bonded servants before, people trapped in a system that was slavery in everything but name. That's not going to happen, he said quietly. You can't stop it with good intentions, Samuel. Margaret used his first name for the first time, and something shifted between them. Peterson has the law on his side, and enough money to buy whatever law he doesn't already own. Thunder rumbled overhead, closer now. The first drops of rain began pattering against the windows. Samuel stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the gathering storm. Maybe, he said slowly, but Peterson made one mistake. What's that? Samuel turned back to face them, and Margaret saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something hard and determined. He assumed I was just another drifter passing through, someone with no resources, no connections, no way to fight back. Aren't you? Lucy asked. Samuel smiled, a real smile this time, not the careful expression he'd been wearing since Peterson's visit. Not exactly, little one, not exactly. Outside, The storm was building to a crescendo, but inside the small cabin, for the first time in months, 3 people began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had found a way to fight back. The slam of Peterson's boot heels against the wooden porch echoed like gunshots in the sudden quiet. Lucy pressed her face to the window, watching the big man stomp away while his coattails flapped behind him like angry bird wings. Her breath made small clouds on the glass as Peterson's shadow grew smaller and smaller down the dusty street. "He's really gone," Lucy whispered, but her voice shook like a leaf in wind. Samuel stood frozen by the door, his hand still reaching for the spot where Peterson had been. The cabin felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together during the visit. Margaret sat down hard in her wooden chair, making it creak under her sudden weight. "What have we done?" Margaret's words came out barely louder than breathing. Samuel turned from the door, studying Margaret's pale face. Her green eyes looked scared, like a rabbit that knows the wolf is still hunting nearby. Her hands twisted in her faded blue dress, the same nervous movement Lucy made when she was worried. "We bought ourselves time," Samuel said, trying to sound sure of himself. "That's more than you had this morning." But even as he spoke, doubt crept into his chest like cold water. Peterson's smile before leaving had been the kind snakes might wear if they could smile too wide and showing too many teeth. Men like Peterson didn't give up easy, especially when someone made them look foolish in front of their hired muscle. Margaret stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She moved to the small stove and began making coffee, even though her hands shook as she measured the grounds. The familiar work seemed to calm her some. "Mr. Morrison," she began, not looking at him while she worked, "you don't know what you've stepped into. Peterson owns the general store, the saloon, and half the houses in town. The sheriff eats at his table every night. Even Reverend Hayes owes him money for fixing the church roof." Lucy left the window and climbed onto Samuel's lap without asking. She weighed no more than a sack of grain, all sharp elbows and knees. Her hair smelled like the soap her mother made from desert plants. "But you're not scared of him," Lucy said to Samuel, making it sound like a question and a statement at the same time. Samuel thought about that. Fear and smart thinking often wore the same clothes. "I'm careful of him," he said finally. "There's a difference." The coffee began to bubble and hiss, filling the cabin with rich brown smells. Margaret poured 3 cups, her movements getting steadier as she focused on the simple task. She handed Samuel his cup and gave Lucy a smaller one with more milk than coffee. "Tell me about your wagon," Margaret said, settling back into her chair. "What kind of supplies do you carry?" The question surprised Samuel. He had expected more worry about Peterson, more talk about what the big man might do next. Instead, Margaret seemed to be studying him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Medicine mostly?" Samuel answered. "Bandages, powders for fever, things the mining camps need but can't get easy. Some tools, nails, rope, whatever people out here can't make for themselves." Margaret nodded slowly. "That's dangerous work, traveling alone with valuable things." "Sometimes." Samuel sipped his coffee, wondering where her questions were heading. "But most folks out here are honest. They need what I carry too much to steal it." "Most folks," Margaret repeated, and Samuel heard the meaning behind her words. Lucy swung her legs from Samuel's lap, making his coffee slosh in the cup. "Mama's really smart," she announced. "She can read and write and do numbers. Papa said she was the smartest person he ever met." A flush of pink crept up Margaret's neck. "Lucy, that's enough." But Samuel leaned forward, interested now. "You can read?" "Some." Margaret's voice was careful, like she wasn't sure if admitting it was safe. "My father was a school teacher back in Missouri, before he died and left us with nothing." Samuel set down his coffee cup with a soft clink. Reading was rare out here, especially among women. Most folks never learned more than their names and simple numbers. A woman who could read and write was worth more than gold in a place like this. "That's why Peterson wants more than just the money," Samuel said. understanding hitting him like a punch to the stomach. Margaret's face went white again. She nodded once, quick and sharp. "He's been talking about needing someone to keep his books," she whispered. "Someone to handle his letters and contracts. He says a woman like me shouldn't be living alone, that it's not proper." Samuel felt anger rising in his chest like heat from a fire. Peterson wasn't just after the rent money, or even Margaret's beauty. He wanted to own her mind, her skills, her ability to read and write. In a frontier town, a person who could handle books and letters was powerful. Peterson wanted that power for himself. "How long has he been saying these things?" Samuel asked. "Since right after the funeral." Margaret's voice was barely a whisper now. "He came by with food and kind words, said he wanted to help, but then the kind words became suggestions. The suggestions became demands." Lucy had gone very quiet, listening to the adult talk with wide eyes. Samuel realized the little girl understood more than she let on. She had been watching the men in town, not just looking for a husband for her mother, but looking for protection from Peterson. "That's why you're so good at judging character," Samuel said to Lucy. "You've been watching for someone strong enough to stand up to Peterson." Lucy nodded solemnly. "Most of the men are scared of him too, or they work for him. But you didn't back down when he got all big and mean." Samuel stood up, walking to the window where Lucy had been watching earlier. The street looked normal, dusty, and quiet, with a few people going about their business. But now he saw it differently. Every building Peterson owned was a piece of control. Every person who owed him money was under his thumb. "There's something else," Margaret said behind him. "Something I haven't told you." Samuel turned around. Margaret was holding a folded paper, her fingers trembling as she smoothed it open. "This came yesterday, before you arrived. It's from the territorial government." Samuel took the paper and read slowly. The words were fancy, full of legal language that was hard to follow, but the meaning was clear enough. Peterson had filed a claim with the territorial office, saying Margaret couldn't pay her debts and should be declared what they called a ward of the territory. "What does that mean?" Lucy asked, seeing the adults' serious faces. Samuel folded the paper carefully, his mind racing. "It means Peterson is trying to use the law to get what he wants. If the territorial judge agrees, Peterson becomes responsible for your mother. Like a guardian. Like she would be his property," Margaret said quietly. The cabin fell silent except for the soft bubbling of coffee on the stove. Outside, a bird called from somewhere far away, its voice lonely and wild. Samuel understood now why Margaret had looked so hopeful when Lucy asked him to marry her. Marriage would make him Margaret's legal guardian instead of Peterson. It was more than just solving a money problem. It was about freedom. "When is the hearing?" Samuel asked. "Monday," Margaret said. "Tomorrow." Samuel felt like he'd been kicked by a horse. Tomorrow. They had one day to figure out how to stop Peterson from getting legal control over Margaret and Lucy. One day to turn his lie about marrying Margaret into truth. "Then we better make sure that wedding happens before Monday morning," Samuel said. The Sunday morning sun hit Mesquite Flats like a hammer hitting an anvil, making the whole town shimmer in waves of heat. Samuel woke before dawn, his body sore from sleeping on the cabin floor but his mind sharp as a knife blade. Today everything would change, one way or another. Margaret was already awake, moving quietly around the small kitchen so she wouldn't wake Lucy. Her hair was pinned up neat and proper, and she wore a dress Samuel hadn't seen before, dark green cotton that brought out her eyes. It was clearly her best dress, saved for special occasions. "You look beautiful," Samuel said softly. Margaret's hands flew to her hair, checking that every pin was in place. "I looked like a woman about to marry a stranger," she replied, but there was no anger in her voice. Just nervous energy that made her move like a bird ready to take flight. "Coffee," she offered, and Samuel nodded. They sat together in the early morning quiet, drinking coffee and not talking much. Sometimes, the most important conversations happened without words. Samuel could see Margaret was thinking hard about something, her forehead wrinkled with concentration. "I keep wondering what my husband would think," she said suddenly, "about all this." Samuel set down his cup carefully. This was dangerous ground, talking about the dead husband. "What do you think he would say?" Margaret smiled, the first real smile Samuel had seen from her. "He would probably laugh. James always said I was too stubborn for my own good. He'd say I found the most complicated way possible to solve a simple problem." "And what's the simple problem?" "Staying alive," Margaret said. "Keeping Lucy safe. Everything else is just details." Lucy stirred in her bed, making small, sleepy sounds. Soon she would wake up, and the day would really begin. Samuel realized this might be his last chance to talk to Margaret alone before they became husband and wife. "About the money," he began. "Don't." Margaret held up her hand. "You spent your savings to help strangers. That tells me everything I need to know about what kind of man you are." Samuel wanted to argue, to explain that it hadn't really been about the money. But Lucy was sitting up now, rubbing her eyes and looking around the cabin like she was trying to remember where she was. "Is today the day?" Lucy asked, her voice thick with sleep. "Today's the day," Samuel confirmed. Lucy bounced out of bed like she was made of springs. "I get to be the flower girl, and the witness, and the maid of honor." Her excitement was catching. Even Margaret started to smile as Lucy danced around the small cabin, listing all the important jobs she would have at the wedding. Samuel found himself grinning too, caught up in the little girl's joy. But as they prepared to leave for the church, Samuel noticed things that worried him. The street was too quiet for a Sunday morning. Most of the windows had their curtains drawn tight, even though it was already getting hot, and there were too many of Peterson's men visible, leaning against buildings and watching the cabin. "Something's wrong," Samuel murmured to Margaret as they stepped outside. She had noticed too. Her hand found Lucy's shoulder, keeping the little girl close. "Maybe we should wait," she whispered. "Try again later when—" "No," Samuel's voice was firm. "Waiting just gives Peterson more time to plan. We do this now." The walk to the church felt like the longest journey Samuel had ever made. Each step raised dust that seemed to hang in the air like smoke signals, announcing their movement to anyone watching. Lucy skipped between the adults, holding both their hands and humming a tune Samuel didn't recognize. Reverend Hayes was waiting for them on the church steps, his best Sunday suit making him look more official than usual. His kind eyes crinkled when he saw them coming, but Samuel caught the worried look the Reverend sent toward Peterson's saloon. "Good morning," Reverend Hayes said warmly. "Are we ready to begin?" "More than ready," Lucy announced, letting go of their hands to run up the church steps. But as they reached the church door, Samuel heard the sound he'd been dreading: heavy footsteps and the jingle of spurs coming up the street. He turned to see Peterson approaching with 4 men, all of them wearing guns and serious expressions. "Reverend Hayes," Peterson called out, his voice carrying easily across the quiet street. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Samuel stepped in front of Margaret and Lucy, his hand moving automatically to the knife at his belt. But Peterson held up both hands, showing he wasn't reaching for a weapon. Now, Peterson said, as he reached the church steps. "No need for violence. This is a legal matter." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, different from the territorial claim Margaret had shown Samuel yesterday. This paper looked official, with ribbons and seals that caught the morning light. "What's that?" Reverend Hayes asked, though his voice suggested he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "An injunction," Peterson said, smiling his snake smile. "Filed with the territorial court yesterday evening. It prevents Mrs. Holloway from entering into any legal contracts, including marriage, until her debt status is resolved." Samuel felt the ground shifting under his feet like quicksand. "You can't do that." "Actually, I can." Peterson unfolded the paper with theatrical care. "According to territorial law, a person with outstanding debts above a certain amount cannot make legal commitments that might affect their ability to repay those debts. Marriage falls under that category." Reverend Hayes took the paper and read it carefully. his face growing more troubled with each line. "This appears to be legitimate," he said reluctantly. Margaret made a small sound like air being let out of a balloon. Lucy looked up at the adults, confusion replacing her earlier excitement. "What does that mean?" Lucy asked. Peterson crouched down to Lucy's level, his voice taking on a fake sweetness that made Samuel's skin crawl. "It means your mama can't get married today, little one. But don't worry, I'll take good care of both of you." Samuel saw red. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Like hell you will." Peterson's men moved too, hands dropping to their gun handles. The cheerful Sunday morning suddenly felt dangerous as a lightning storm. "Gentlemen," Reverend Hayes said firmly, stepping between them, "this is the Lord's house. Whatever disagreements you have can be settled elsewhere." But Peterson wasn't finished. He stood up slowly, brushing dust from his knees, and pulled out another paper. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice dripping with false regret. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest." "What?" Samuel's voice cracked like a whip. "Fraud," Peterson explained, clearly enjoying himself. "You claim to be Mrs. Holloway's intended husband, to interfere with illegal debt collection. That's a territorial crime." One of Peterson's men stepped forward with iron shackles, the metal gleaming in the sunlight. Samuel realized with growing horror that Peterson had planned this whole thing perfectly. He had used the law like a weapon, turning Samuel's attempt to help into a trap. Margaret grabbed Samuel's arm. "Run," she whispered urgently. "Take your wagon and go. Don't let him destroy your life, too." But Samuel looked down at Lucy, who was staring up at him with eyes full of trust and hope. How could he explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes the good guys didn't win? That sometimes bad men with money and power got whatever they wanted? "I'm not running," Samuel said quietly. Peterson's grin widened. "Smart man. Fighting the law never ends well." The man with the shackles stepped closer, reaching for Samuel's hands. Time seemed to slow down, like honey dripping from a spoon. Samuel could hear birds singing somewhere far away, could smell the desert sage and the coffee still lingering on Margaret's breath, could feel Lucy's small hand slip into his. Everything was about to change, again. But as the shackles touched Samuel's wrists, a new voice cut through the morning air like a bell ringing. "Stop right there." Everyone turned to see who had spoken, and Samuel's heart leaped with sudden hope. Peterson's boots hit the chapel steps, like thunder before lightning strikes. Samuel felt his stomach drop as the big man charged toward them, his face red with anger. Behind Peterson came 2 other men, their hands resting on their gun handles like they were ready for trouble. The peaceful morning had just turned dangerous. "Stop right there, Reverend!" Peterson shouted, waving a piece of paper in the air. "Nobody's getting married today." Lucy grabbed her mother's skirt and peeked around it. Margaret's face turned white as fresh snow. Samuel stepped in front of both of them, his heart beating fast but his voice staying calm. "What seems to be the problem, Peterson?" Samuel asked. Peterson climbed the steps slowly, like a cat stalking a mouse. "The problem is that Mrs. Holloway can't marry anyone. She belongs to me now." "That's impossible," Reverend Hayes said, but his voice shook a little. Peterson unfolded the paper with a nasty smile. "According to this here legal document, filed yesterday with the territorial government, Mrs. Holloway owes me money she can't pay. That means she has to work for me until the debt gets settled." Margaret gasped. "You can't do that. I'm a free woman." "Not anymore, you ain't." Peterson's smile got bigger and meaner. "Frontier law says when someone can't pay their debts, they can be bound to service. Like having a job you can't quit." Samuel's hands turned into fists. He had heard of such laws, usually used on criminals or people who broke contracts, but using it on a widow trying to survive seemed evil. "How much does she owe?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. $63 became $78 with interest and filing fees. Plus, there's a penalty for trying to avoid payment by getting married. Peterson pretended to read the paper. "That brings it to $95 total." The number hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. $95 was more money than most people in this town saw in 2 years. It was almost everything he had saved. Lucy tugged on her mother's dress. "Mama, what does he mean?" Margaret knelt down and hugged her daughter tight. "It means Mr. Peterson thinks he owns us now, sweetheart." "But he doesn't really, right?" Lucy's voice was small and scared. Samuel looked at the little girl's frightened face and felt something change inside him. He had spent years running from responsibility, avoiding getting too close to people who might need him. But looking at Lucy and Margaret, he realized some things were worth fighting for. "Actually," Samuel said, reaching into his coat, "I think there might be another solution." Peterson laughed. "Oh yeah? What's that?" Samuel pulled out his leather money pouch. It was heavy with coins he had saved for 3 long years. Every dollar represented days of hard work, nights sleeping under stars, meals of beans and hardtack. The money was supposed to buy him a better life in California. "Cash payment," Samuel said. "Right here, right now." Peterson's laugh died in his throat. His eyes got wide as he stared at the pouch. "You're bluffing," Peterson said, but he didn't sound sure anymore. Samuel poured the coins into his hand. Gold and silver pieces caught the morning sunlight. There were enough coins to buy a small ranch, or start a business, or live comfortably for years. "Count them," Samuel said. Peterson's hands shook a little as he reached for the money. His 2 men moved closer, probably thinking about grabbing the coins and running, but something in Samuel's calm confidence made them hesitate. As Peterson counted, his face went through several changes. First greedy excitement, then confusion, then anger, as he realized the count was exactly right. $95, Peterson said through gritted teeth. "This clears the debt." "Good," Samuel said. "Then Mrs. Holloway is free to marry whoever she chooses." But Peterson wasn't done yet. He pocketed the money and stepped closer to Samuel. "You think this changes anything? You think paying her debt makes you some kind of hero?" "I think it makes me someone who keeps his promises," Samuel replied. Peterson's face got redder. "This is still my town, Morrison. Accidents happen to people who cause trouble. Houses catch fire. Wagons break down in dangerous places. Sometimes people just disappear." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Samuel felt Margaret move closer behind him, her hand touching his shoulder. Lucy pressed against his leg, looking up at him with trust that made his chest tight. "You know what I think, Peterson?" Samuel said, his voice getting quieter but somehow stronger. "I think you're scared." "Scared? Of what?" "Scared that people might see you for what you really are. A bully who picks on widows and children because real men would fight back." Peterson's hand moved toward his gun, but Samuel didn't back down. "I also think," Samuel continued, "that this town is full of good people who are tired of being pushed around. People who might just find their courage if someone gave them a reason to stand together." Samuel looked around at the crowd that had gathered. Shopkeepers, miners, farmers, and their families had come to watch the confrontation. In their faces, Samuel saw something Peterson might have missed: anger at watching a widow and child being threatened. "So here's what's going to happen," Samuel said. "You're going to take your money and walk away. You're going to leave the Holloway family alone. And if anything unfortunate happens to any of us, well," Samuel smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "I've got friends in every town between here and California. People who know how to track down men who hurt innocent folks." Peterson looked around at the crowd, seeming to notice for the first time that nobody looked happy with him. His 2 men shifted uncomfortably, clearly not eager to start trouble with so many witnesses. "This isn't over," Peterson muttered, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Yes, it is," Samuel said firmly. "It's completely over." As Peterson and his men disappeared down the dusty street, Samuel felt the weight of what he had just done, settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. $95. Gone. Every penny he had saved. Every dream of starting fresh in California. every plan for his future, handed over to save two people he had known for less than a week. "Mr. Morrison," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You gave him everything, didn't you?" Samuel turned to face her, seeing his own reflection in her green eyes. "I gave him money," he said simply, "but I got something better in return." Lucy bounced on her toes, her fear forgotten in the excitement of the moment. "Are you really going to marry Mama now?" Samuel looked down at the little girl who had started this whole adventure with her desperate plea. 3 days ago, he had been a lonely man with a wagon full of supplies and a heart full of walls. Now he stood on the steps of a frontier chapel, surrounded by people who seemed to genuinely care what happened to him. "That depends on your mother," Samuel said. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "You spent your life savings on strangers. Why would you do such a thing?" Samuel thought about the question seriously. Why had he done it? The practical answer was that he felt sorry for them. The honest answer was more complicated. "Do you know what I was planning to do with that money?" Samuel asked. Margaret shook her head. "I was going to buy land in California, build a house, maybe start a freight business, live alone and tell myself I was happy." Samuel looked around at the small crowd, still watching them. "But you know what? I've been alone for 15 years, and the only thing it ever got me was more alone." Reverend Hayes stepped forward. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside the chapel?" The inside of the small church was cool and dim. Sunlight streamed through windows that had seen better days, casting rainbow patterns on the worn wooden floor. Samuel had been in many churches over the years, but this one felt different somehow. It felt like hope. "Margaret," Samuel said, taking her hands in his, "I want you to know that I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not ready to give. This marriage can be whatever we decide to make it." Margaret looked into his eyes, searching for something. "You mean it would be a partnership? Not just you taking care of us?" "I mean, I've been carrying supplies across the desert for years, but I never learned how to build a home. I think maybe you could teach me that." Lucy climbed onto one of the wooden benches. "And I could help. I know how to cook beans, and I can mend clothes, and I'm really good at spotting rattlesnakes." Samuel and Margaret both laughed, and some of the tension in the air melted away. "There's something else you should know," Margaret said quietly. "I loved my first husband very much. It wouldn't be fair to expect you to replace him." Samuel nodded. "And I loved my first wife. But maybe we don't need to replace what we've lost. Maybe we can build something new." Reverend Hayes opened his worn Bible. "Love comes in many forms," he said gently. "Sometimes it strikes like lightning. Sometimes it grows slowly, like seeds in good soil. Both kinds can be blessed." Samuel looked at Margaret again. Her face was calmer now, more thoughtful than desperate. "I have a confession," Margaret said. "When Lucy first suggested asking you to marry me, I was horrified. Not because you seemed like a bad man, but because I was raised to believe in marrying for love." "And now?" Samuel asked. "Now I think maybe love isn't just a feeling. Maybe it's also a choice, a decision to build something good together, even when the world tries to tear it down." Lucy piped up from her perch on the bench. "Does this mean you're going to kiss now? Because in the books, people always kiss at weddings." Samuel and Margaret looked at each other and burst out laughing. The sound echoed off the chapel walls, mixing with the distant noise of the town outside. "I think," Samuel said, "we can start with shaking hands and work our way up to kissing." Margaret smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. "That sounds perfect." Reverend Hayes cleared his throat. "Shall we begin the ceremony?" As they stood before the simple wooden altar, Samuel realized that his money hadn't just bought Margaret's freedom from debt. It had bought him freedom from loneliness. Freedom from always running toward the horizon without ever finding what he was looking for. The ceremony was simple. No fancy words or expensive rings. Just two people promising to take care of each other and a little girl who had been brave enough to ask a stranger for help. When Reverend Hayes said, "You may kiss the bride," Samuel and Margaret looked at each other and started laughing again. "How about that handshake?" Margaret suggested. They shook hands solemnly, while Lucy clapped and cheered. Outside, the desert sun continued its journey across the sky, but inside the little chapel, 3 people had found something worth more than gold. As they walked out of the church together, Samuel realized that the best adventures weren't always about reaching a destination. Sometimes they were about finding the courage to stay in one place and build something beautiful with people who chose to love you back. Lucy skipped ahead of them, already making plans for their new life together. Samuel and Margaret walked side by side, not quite touching, but not quite apart either. "So what happens now?" Margaret asked. Samuel looked around at the town of Mesquite Flats, dusty, rough, and full of possibility. "Now we figure out how to be a family. Think we can do it?" Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "I think we can do anything."